One thing that was consistent all throughout that journey from 2017 to date has been each year I find a deeper reason why I feel this is like the most consequential thing I could do with my life in terms of providing actual impact on the ground as both an African and a global citizen. So for me, I felt one of the primary reasons behind all of the work that I do on the ground is to provide this same level of freedom that I know I've enjoyed for years to other people around the world, especially here in Africa, where we have a ton of problems when it comes to financial freedom. But the way in which we're approaching it moving forward is to not only build on those type of successes, but to make sure we have a model that helps replicate, or not even replicate, but create even more successful companies at a steadier rate. I think what will be cool to see is how quickly we'll go from being looked at as a part of the world that isn't contributing as much to Bitcoin to having a point where it's almost impossible to talk about Bitcoin development or the Bitcoin space without talking about Africa first.
Hello, Bitcoiners. Welcome to another super exciting episode of the ABC podcast. Today is really super exciting because we have one of the African finest Bitcoin core contributor with us. He has been a pioneering force when it comes to Bitcoin development in Africa. He is also the CEO of Btrust, which is an African non-profit that is dedicated to grooming the next generation of African Bitcoin developers and also fostering a vibrant community among the developers in Africa. He also leads the Recursive Capital, a VC fund in Africa that is focused on empowering and supporting Bitcoin projects across Africa. And then, of course, he's also a Forbes digital asset contributor where he continuously shares insight on the development on the Bitcoin ecosystem in Africa. He is a man of many things when it comes to Bitcoin in Africa. I'm really excited to have you join us today, Abubakar. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us in the conversation today. So we are going to discuss a range of things because I know that you have been doing quite a lot when it comes to Bitcoin in Africa, from development to building the communities to promoting adoption, and of course to also letting the world know what is really happening in the ecosystem in Africa. So we'll discuss about all these things, but first of all, I would really like to know how you discovered Bitcoin as a developer and how you started building on Bitcoin to becoming one of the pioneering Bitcoin core contributors in Africa.
Yeah, sure. Honestly, it wasn't necessarily one of those things that I set out to do as a priority. So I finished high school in 2016, and the idea for me was I had so much time on my hand. I was trying to go back to, well, not go back, but go to college to study architecture essentially. But around 2017, started hearing more about Bitcoin from my older brother. We started reading articles on Bitcoin Magazine, Hacker Noon, and a bunch of other sources. But the issue I had at the time was like I wasn't technical or anything like that. So I was reading a lot of things that were very, very technical at the time. So I figured with all the free time that I have right now, I might as well start reading up about computer science and things like that. So I did a lot of that. And then by the end of 2017, I'd already started understanding, at least to a certain degree, exactly what I was reading. By 2018, I started teaching myself how to code. And from that year on, to be honest, was when I decided I wasn't going to go to college because by 2019 I started contributing to Bitcoin Core. And then beyond that, I would say one thing that was consistent all throughout that journey from 2017 to date has been each year I find a deeper reason why I feel this is like the most consequential thing I could do with my life in terms of providing actual impact on the ground as both an African and a global citizen. So I'd say it definitely just started as one of those things where I felt this is very interesting technology, all the way up to, I can actually use this as actual money. So I started doing a lot of freelance stuff back in like 2018, 19, getting paid in Bitcoin. And since then, I haven't looked back. Like all my money's still in Bitcoin, and I essentially enjoy all that freedom. So for me, I felt one of the primary reasons behind all of the work that I do on the ground is to provide this same level of freedom that I know I've enjoyed for years to other people around the world, especially here in Africa, where we have a ton of problems when it comes to financial freedom.
Awesome. That's really some inspiring journey there. But when you started developing or contributing on Bitcoin Core, whether other Africans already building on Bitcoin, because that's really quite early, starting around 2018, 2019.
Oh yeah, definitely. It was interesting. So the same month I made my Bitcoin Core contribution in 2019, I think October or so, I actually saw a pull request from Tim Akimbo, who had already had his PR emerged. Essentially, one of the first contributions from an African, at least to my mind, was actually from him. And that inspired me, honestly, to contribute because I was like, okay, there are folks from Nigeria that are doing this. Like, what's my excuse? So I decided to just go for it, really. And I think without that, I probably wouldn't have contributed, or I've still been doubting myself.
Awesome, because I mean that's really quite early from 2018, 2019 to start contributing to Bitcoin Core in Africa, and it's really interesting and also inspiring to see that we've had people that's been there, the voice that also making changes. Because I know a lot of Africans, for many reasons, they use Bitcoin and they trust Bitcoin for people who who understand how it works. Because I know since you started quite early, there must has been like some challenges when trying to get started. Like, did you experience any challenges? Because like you said, you saw someone. I didn't know there was already someone from Africa that was already building at that point. But when you started building, were there any challenges that you faced as a developer from Africa or from Nigeria that just starting to build on Bitcoin?
Oh yeah, a lot. I mean, first and foremost was actually compiling Bitcoin Core. It's not like I had the most state-of-the-art machine to do so, so it took quite a lot of time to do that, and then having to create the actual pull request itself, going through Bitcoin Core for the first time, which was when I made the first pull request. Other than that, I'd say what was interesting, especially about Tim, is he was again someone I looked up to in the space. So it was really interesting that 2 years later we decided, after Bernard approached us, that's Bernard Power from BitNob. So he approached me, Carla from Lightning Labs at the time, who's now a full-time Lightning developer slash engineer, as well as Tim, and we started a program called Gala in 2021. So it was a real full circle moment at the time. I think going back to 2019 with the first pull request, the major issues I had honestly was there wasn't any sort of defined pathway for developers on the ground that want to start going into Bitcoin Core, both as a career and even just contributing to open source in general. And I think and I'll look back and I think a lot has definitely changed again through the incredible work from like Allah now and Btrust and Btrust builders. I think the primary things for me were kind of three things in general. One would be the lack of understanding of exactly how the culture works in open source. Because it's not like I was a hardcore open source developer before then. Like 2019 was the first time I tried to contribute, and I think, or maybe late 2018 to general open source. So there's a lot of understanding, and I think that the most important thing that happened to me that changed my perspective was how welcoming it was on Bitcoin Core at the time. And you can imagine, like the first pull request, I was asking quite a lot of dumb questions in hindsight, but they were very, very kind and patient with me, walking me through all of that. And I think the second thing really that was kind of difficult was understanding where to start in terms of where should I contribute and things like that. And then over time is when I realized that there are things like tags on GitHub that allow you to understand, okay, this is maybe a good first issue for people that are new to the project. And the last one I would say honestly is like, and this is again from 2019 all the way up to 2020, is I think there is a lack of understanding about exactly what the possibilities are. Do you get paid? Do you not get paid? Or are there ways in which you could actually gauge kind of the career progression on that end? So that was, I'd say, the major challenges I had in terms of navigating the space.
Awesome. Just to ask, do you see any of those challenges today, like the challenges you had when you were starting, or is it quite different challenges now in the space, or do you still see the same thing?
A lot has changed. I can tell you, Nick. The first one is definitely that now working in open source, there's a lot more funding in open source development. One of the larger funders, obviously being Btrust, for example, where we fund quite a lot of developers, especially core developers now like Abubakar, Kelvin, um, Novo, and some other folks, Annie and the rest. I think the other thing is that pathway that we lacked like 5 years ago now exists. In fact, it exists in a way in which, honestly, if I was to rewind time, I would love to have been part of like Trust Builders and all these programs that now exist. I think that the closest thing we had then was Code, which already the barrier to entry was already too high for someone like me who at the time had basically no knowledge. But I think now the time span it takes or the timeline it takes from you don't know anything about Bitcoin, like you don't know what the hell a block is and things like that, all the way up to contributing to Bitcoin Core has definitely shortened. I think a good example is a worker who works on the mempool and on Bitcoin Core. He actually, within a year, I think from last year to date, is the timeline of all his involvement with Bitcoin, which is incredible because he's one of the more prolific developers on the continent. I think he's one of the top 20 in the last 6 months in terms of Bitcoin core contribution. So it's definitely changed a lot. I think the one thing that maybe still needs some more improvement is how developers are able to track kind of career progression and seeing whether they're actually making progress or they're still kind of in the same loop of things that they're comfortable doing. So a lot of that is being addressed honestly by kind of the work that we've been doing in Btrust Builders and how we kind of see our cohorts and especially on the Btrust side in terms of grants and the reason why we decided to split our grants into starter grants as well as an open source cohort that has like mentorship and things like that. That way they're able to actually get a second, advice slash comment in terms of how to move across the space, going from stage to stage and things like that.
Awesome. That's really great. And I can also quite see that a lot has changed since then because I know from 2021 up to now, we've had a lot of people now building on Bitcoin. I also know that, in early 2021, when we were doing some education, we were like, yeah, there was like a bit of problem when someone that is a developer says, okay, I want to start, where do I start from? So it was kind of difficult until we discovered that there is already Kala that is teaching people. So it was easy to redirect people. And I know that it has really helped a lot of developers. And now they have a blueprint, all thanks to you, to Bernard, and to everyone who, set up the Kala and also Btrust and, trying to help these developers. I know that all these challenges that you faced, really helped you to begin to say, okay, this is what I want to do, or this is how we should do Btrust, or this is how we should start Color or Recursive, Capital. So, how did the challenges that you experienced in your days of beginning as a Bitcoin contributor influence, these decisions on how you build, Btrust builders or Recursive Capital?
Oh, for sure. And I'll start with recursive because it was kind of interesting. I mean, it's not like I have like a decade's worth of investment banking or VC space, I guess, experience. So it was kind of funny. Like in 2020, no, 2019 actually, started having convos with a lot of folks, primarily my older brother, who's an economics major. And some of the conversations started as, okay, how is the space going to be in like the next 5, 10 years? Like, what are the things that we can start doing now to make sure that it's a healthy space? And we started talking more in depth about funding and things like that. And obviously, at the time, it's not like I knew a great ton about that. So a lot of it was learning exactly what things like VCs are and all of that. And it kind of, I guess, crescendoed in I'd say January of 2020 was when I started taking a lot more seriously and looking at it. And at the time, it was already clear to me that my older brother was going down the government path, which was totally separate from obviously leading such a fund and things like that. So for me, my primary objective at the time was, okay, this is an interesting idea. And at the time, like nobody was really talking about this or even discussing this, at least to my knowledge. So for me, it was okay, if this is such an important part of building the future. It's not worthwhile to wait around for someone else to do it. So I was like, you know what? I might not have the experience, but I know that at least in terms of on the technical side and things like that, I could get by. So I decided to launch Recursive in 2020, February, I believe. And since then to date, I've definitely learned a lot. I think one of the things that really helped me was, again, I'm as kind of as I guess evidenced by how I've gone through the space and navigated all through the last couple of years. It's definitely evident to anyone watching that I'm a person that thrives with challenges and kind of seeks challenges, to be honest. And I think that has probably been the fastest way in which I've been able to learn a lot of things that would have likely taken me along a lot more time. So with Recursive, a lot of it was reaching out to every single VC that exists, that is a Bitcoin VC. And at the time, really, our thesis was like a combination of all the things that I felt was happening in the space. So I was calling it Web3. Obviously, I had to rebrand that a year after that, after realizing that that just attracted the wrong investments. So the idea for me was Bitcoin being the primary aspect in which people can gain financial freedom. And then on the other side is like privacy preserving protocols and tools like that. So the combination of the both is what I felt was kind of happening in terms of the emergence of all this type of frontier technology. So by 2021, I believe, was when we started talking to Bernard Power from BitNob, and that was the year I made my first investment, which was in BitNob. And then subsequent years was when I started understanding a lot more about how VC works, like restructuring the VC itself to an actual standard venture capital fund. Got in the initial set of investors. We made some more investments in other companies like Sonota and Fedi. And since then, it's definitely been one of those things where each year, the depth of understanding and like the capacity in which we're able to handle new investments, kind of structure foundations that are necessary for this ecosystem to thrive in Africa primarily has been both refreshing and honor, and honestly has been very cool to see, especially given all the development that's happening on the company side. Initially, there was virtually no developers really for us to fund companies because obviously you need the developers building in terms of the company. So it was cool to see how the work from Gala and the Btrust builders has completely changed the landscape in terms of the number
Yeah.
of companies and the quality. And with Btrust builders, I think the most interesting part was, again, started as Gala. We did a lot of work in terms of testing out the theory that are there even developers in Africa that are interested in this? And we're definitely proven right in terms of the interest. Secondly, was looking at what's the most sustainable way in which you could do it. So initially, the focus was getting them jobs. Like literally, you just ask folks like, if you want to get into this program, like you have to quit your job. We're going to pay you. And we're going to make sure that you get a job. That worked. The second year, that didn't work as well because it was kind of a bear market. So we realized immediately that we need a more sustainable path, which is where Trust Builders was birthed. And the idea with that is to shift from getting them job placement into getting them into open source. Because the thing with open source is, regardless of the price of Bitcoin, people are still interested and are needed in that market. So the idea was moving that and kind of shifting the perspective. And we've definitely seen great success. And I'd say in the last 2 years, we managed to train, I think, close to 300 folks. We have like a thriving community of like 450 developers in the last 2 years alone. So even that alone to me was mind blowing in terms of
Yeah.
going from basically like five developers in Africa all the way up to having a critical mass of hundreds really, and all in the span of just 2 years. So I think there's definitely that grit, that hunger for people to contribute in Africa. It was just one of those things where there was no clarity, there was no funding, and there was no actual pathway for them to go from zero to Bitcoin developers.
Yeah, again, kudos to you because I know it always has to start, with one person, even though you didn't, have it all figured out or clear on which part to follow, but then you started and look at where we are today. So, I mean, a tree just begins to grow and then it begins to sprout and have many branches, and that is basically what we are seeing today in the ecosystem with the development. It has been like really, really huge and mind blowing. And I think maybe for this your starting experience, I hope that maybe someday you can pen it down, how it all started, how you got the footprint so that people can see and then people can also really understand how all these things began and how we got where we are today. Um, yeah, so now let's go a little bit deeper about your work and your roles and the projects you are grooming and stuffs like that. So I would want to ask you first because recently you assumed the role of CEO of Btrust. Even though it's like months now, but congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So yeah, so I would like to ask you, as the CEO of Btrust, how do you really see the role or the importance of training African developers in transforming the local ecosystem of development in Africa?
Oh, but I think they're probably one of the most central points really for us in terms of how we build a more hopeful future with like abundance and a lot of prosperity on the ground. Like if we go back to, the earlier conversation we're having on the consequence of having more developers, not only does it advance the ecosystem, but it serves as kind of a bedrock really for everything else to thrive, whether it's more companies, more tools, more resources, even on the education side. Because again, if no one is building, there's really nothing to educate people about. So a lot of that is hand in hand. And I think what's interesting with Btrust, especially in terms of the overall vision, is just for those who are listening and maybe aren't exactly familiar with our operations. Essentially, Btrust is set up to decentralize Bitcoin development, specifically in the global south. So we're talking about places like Africa, Latin America, India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, and places like that. Basically, anywhere that Bitcoin development is not as common as, say, North America or Europe. And with us, really, the idea was as soon as we got selected as board members, we realized obviously that we're all African. So it's not a case where we could go out and start doing things in like Latin America where we
Mhm.
basically have no expertise, for example. So the initial idea was to make sure that we start in a place where we have a lot more expertise and understanding about how it works. So Africa was a natural place for us to start. And the thing with Africa that was interesting is, like I said, it wasn't a place that was like thriving with Bitcoin developers to begin with. So we had to think through first principles in terms of what does it mean for Btrust and kind of the core values that we had. We settled on five Genesis principles, and not to get into all of them, but primarily being things like being Bitcoin only, making sure that we're ensuring that that's the core focus, being open source, and that kind of led us down the path of understanding that for us to get this sort of thriving ecosystem from ground up, we need a very effective pipeline that churns out a steady, high quality rate of developers. And that was the decision behind why we got Gala essentially into Btrust. And from that point onward, it was very clear to us that now that we have this engine that's churning out developers, we can actually focus on three aspects really more broadly. So one is the output of that process, which gets into the grants process and making sure these guys are funded and things like that. And then in the middle of it is now that we have this engine that works, we now have to keep tweaking it and maintaining it to make sure that it maintains that high level of quality and honestly even improves it over time to make sure the yield is higher. And then way up in the beginning is understanding what are the places and where are the places really that we can find these developers of interest, as people put it. And a lot of that had to do with getting into the existing spaces where developers are in Africa, whether it's the open source community or even sometimes, honestly, like companies and things like that. We get a lot of folks that have gone through our program that essentially send them as referrals to their buddies saying, hey guys, job security is hard and things like that. But since I got into Btrust Builders, I've been employed really. And that's the story for a lot of the folks that end up getting grants. And I'll give another example too. Like there was a developer that got into Gala, I think when we first started, I think the first cohort. Since then to date, since he quit his job and went full Bitcoin, he's been employed. And quite a number of his friends have all been going through different jobs. Some are even like unemployed till date. So I think that played a huge role in terms of people understanding the not only the effects and benefits, but the consequences of going down the path of having a Bitcoin job and the difference in terms of job security and stability. And in terms of how I see my role as CEO with Btrust is Btrust is not going to thrive on its own without a good amount of structure, without an understanding of what's necessary for the space to thrive in terms of structures and foundations. And more importantly, it definitely needs a level of vision that is in tandem or congruent to kind of the both the evolution of Bitcoin as well as the development of Bitcoin. So a lot of the way I'm approaching this is again all the learning I've had essentially running, Gala alongside Bernard and the others, as well as primarily as a developer myself. So it's one of those things where I feel things that we were missing back in my day, quote unquote,
Yeah.
and things that people need right now is very important. So a lot of it is making sure that we have a steady cadence of grants that we're announcing in terms of making a quarterly basis. That way, people know that we're essentially open for you to apply at any point. But the idea is to make sure that we have a steady state of folks knowing that there is a process from applying all the way up to getting the grants and then having them announced. Other things are looking at ways in which we can expand some of the operations that we've had in terms of sponsoring conferences that we do. So this year we're going to launch the first developer day, which the idea is to make it a yearly thing for ABC. The idea is to make sure that we have a full day's worth of programming for developers, making sure that that gets translated into the entire theme of the conference. That way we have a lot more control over exactly the programming, making sure it doesn't disrupt the overall conference, for example. And other things really that we started looking at is expanding again because our remit is not just Africa, it's also other parts of the world. So we've already started exploring funding developer programs in places like Latin America, India with Bitshala, for example. So a lot of that has been, again, looking at all that we've done so far, seeing what we can improve, but more importantly, looking at the future and looking ahead and making sure that we have everything we need, whether it's for 2025 all the way up to the next decade plus. So a lot of my work, honestly, has just been making sure that everything is top notch with Btrust in terms of what is necessary, structures and things like that. So a lot of folks who are interested in this space in general should just keep an eye on all the work we'll be doing. There's a lot of things in the pipeline.
Oh, so yeah, like you said, a lot of things, and I'm really looking forward to having these things in place and seeing them play out because it's really important when we have African developers who are building what we are consuming in Africa. Because now, from your experience, you built all these things, and also the developers that are being groomed in the Btrust builders, they also really build products based on their own personal experience from maybe their financial experience or any aspect in Africa. So it makes sense to really have what we consume as Bitcoin products really built uh, basically by Africans. A lot has been happening, but we are still, get there and have more impact in terms of developers that are building in Africa. And this, leads me to my next question for you. I think earlier in the conversation you mentioned that The Btrust builders has trained about 300 to 400 developers already. Can you, throw a little bit more light on the success story of Btrust builders so far?
Definitely, there's so much to choose from, but just broadly, the way you should think about this is we're not just churning out these developers that go into open source fully, but we're also building a critical mass of developers that would take on the responsibility of building the ecosystem further. So we're looking at ways in which we could have developers that go from not knowing anything about Bitcoin to becoming actual solid Bitcoin engineers that cut across the ecosystem. So we're talking about engineers that end up being engineering managers. We're talking about engineers that end up heading engineering roles when it comes to training, for example. And what's been interesting is the way we've approached training developers is not just you come in, get trained, you leave, and then you're thrown into essentially the world. The way we do that is as soon as you're trained, the idea is you're part of this larger Btrust ecosystem or community, really, which is where the 450 plus folks are. And once you're part of that community, depending on how you want to structure yourself or your career, you can decide to start contributing back to the program as like a chaperone, a person that's in charge of maybe running some of the stand-ups and things like that. And over time, we've seen that has helped advance a lot of folks that would have otherwise just gone into open source, probably have been fed up and frustrated with the whole process. Now, understanding and taking on a more leadership role, which is very, very important if you're trying to build an ecosystem from scratch. So, that's one of the things that I think the team has definitely been very, very proud of is the ability of our developers to come out of this program, still contribute to the program, as well as advancing their careers in open source. So, other things include like being mentors to current folks in the cohorts. I think that's been very interesting and important to see the dynamic of with each successive generation. A lot of these developers are more attuned to exactly what's necessary for the next generation to become even better than themselves, which is very important. I think the other things we could talk about in terms of success stories is maybe just three broad, I guess, categories. One is definitely the job security that I mentioned earlier, with a lot of them being far longer employed than a lot of their peers, which obviously in the context of Africa, this is something that is one very novel when we're talking about crypto more broadly. It's not a space that has long-term job security is the way I'd put it. Most of the time,
Yeah.
the folks that work in crypto are going from one job to another because the companies either bust or fail or really sometimes unbeknownst to them just working for a scam essentially. And with Bitcoin, we've seen that there's that longevity, which is very, very important because we all know that a lot of these developers have a large amount of dependencies, whether it comes to family, extended family, all of that. So it's definitely helped in terms of socioeconomic mobility as well. I think that the second thing that's interesting is in terms of the developers that come out, again, one of the things I would prioritize, even way back in the Gala days, was to make sure that these developers write and catalog their development to as developers in terms of what they've done, what they've learned, and specifically topics. So we found there's an interesting intersection where we have all these high quality developers coming out, and because they have such a large amount of proof of work in terms of the writing they've been doing, the contributions, some of them have gone into a lot more deeper writing about technical topics that other people, even outside of Africa, rely on in terms of um, advancing their own careers in the open source space. There was an example we had earlier, I think that was probably like last year or so, where some of the articles that one of our developers had been writing for quite a while was seen by one of the open source projects that they ended up working for. And the I think when they were talking to him initially, they brought it up. They were like, oh, we've been reading a lot of your material. We found it very useful internally. So I think that was one of the surprising consequences of having that type of structure for them. Initially, the point was for them to have this as material generally and maybe other developers, but the reach has been global. And I think the last one really that's been I'd say pretty impressive too is again, because these developers are working open source, all the work that they do is going to be public forever and is going to follow them forever. So the interesting thing has been seeing some of the developers go from project to project and advancing themselves and going higher and higher each time. Because each time they come and approach a new project, it's very obvious that this person has clearly been in the open source space doing a lot of work. So that definitely helps them out in terms of not requiring a large amount of CV or work or maybe even certifications, which is technically the majority of what you see in traditional tech. So yeah, I'd say those are the main differences we've seen that are honestly nowhere else to be found but the Bitcoin space.
Yeah, nowhere to be found, just like you said. I can, completely agree because I know a few of my friends who passed through Bitrust builders and now they are building and I can basically see the difference. And most times when you even tell them, oh, someone wants to do this on Bitcoin, are you able to do it? Most times they don't even really have time. They're like, oh, I'm doing this project now, or I have something now. So I can really see the difference in terms of job security, in terms of their output when they get to lay their hands on any Bitcoin project, or you tell them to help someone to build one or two things. So I can really see, and most of them also say it that, I mean, I've had conversation with people that have passed through Btrust builders, and they can attest how the approach in teaching them and how they learn, they really say it's really of high quality. It's another kudos to you and everyone in Trust Builders that is helping us to groom these developers. Yes, so now I know that there has been a lot of support to these developers and trying to groom them. But do you see that we need more than we have now, more than the support that is being currently given to the developers? Do you think there is more support is needed for them, maybe in terms of resources or financially or otherwise?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think like one of the ways in which people should think about this problem is what we're trying to solve is carving out a novel space in Africa and more broadly the world. Like the worst thing that can happen to Bitcoin right now is for everyone to throw their hands up in the air and celebrate 80 something thousand and go, hey, we've won, everything is done. But the thing is with software, software essentially takes two states. It's either it's not maintained, which means likely deprecated, no one's using it, or it's continuously being maintained. Like it has no mid state of it's finished. So I think people have to understand that over time, we're going to still require developers constantly working on Bitcoin. And the thing with such a complex piece of software like Bitcoin is it has so many intricate parts and has so many far-reaching consequences that are of global implications, whether it's all the way from an individual in like maybe let's say Anambra, like a Chidi in Anambra trying to send money, all the way up to nation states that are trying to seek the path to financial freedom. So I think in the near future slash really in the next maybe couple decades, the primary thing for us is to make sure that we're looking at this from a very, very sophisticated level to make sure that we have as much resilience on Bitcoin as possible. And the path in which we can achieve that is to make sure that the developers that are building this are just as resilient or even more resilient than the protocol itself. So hence why the focus in the global south, specifically in Africa, I think mainly a lot of the things really is just the fact that Btrust is solving a problem that is one, discovering a new space, really. Two, is making sure that we do so in a way in which that it is very, very sustainable long term. But the challenge is obviously there are no blueprints really to follow. And without Btrust, there isn't any other organization that's doing this type of work. So a lot of things that we have to deal with and reconcile is making sure that we're not only fixing the way in which Btrust approaches training developers, giving out grants, we're making sure that everyone else that we're sponsoring or people that we're interacting with our network, whether it's other grant organizations like Brink or OpenSats, we're also creating a very cohesive ecosystem that allows for everyone's pipelines to mix and gel with everyone else's pipelines. That way, even if it's someone in the diaspora that's maybe in the United States that's looking to contribute to this global movement, there's a way in which they could be piped into our own program, and vice versa. If there's some other developer who might not be African, you might find it very interesting to see some of the novel frontier technologies or innovations that are in our programs. What are the ways in which they can contribute and get involved? I think a lot of that has to do with again, fine tuning some of that collaborative work, so some of the pipeline work, but more specifically with us internally, a lot of the work has been first and foremost launching our website, which has been a long time coming. So in terms of reaching out to Btrust, gone are the days of having to know the actual board members. So a lot of that is going to keep on being more streamlined in terms of opening that up to conferences and making sure that they have a place to apply. Same thing with projects. And more specifically, the primary one, obviously for us, the largest use case for us, or I should say focus is on the developer side, which is why on day one, all our grant programs have been available for people to apply. So there isn't that idea of when are we opening our applications or things like that. And like I said, all our applications, regardless of the category or the stage in which you're trying to look at and be involved, all of them are open throughout the year. So there's no idea of start now, stop later, because we know this ecosystem is so dynamic. It's not a case where you could time these type of things. So in general, I'd say that's the way in which, at least personally, I look at the space and the work that Btrust is involved with and kind of the things that we're looking to sort out in the next couple of years, really.
Awesome, and I'm just looking forward to see a lot more because I know that, like you said, a lot more is in the pipeline, and it will be really good to see how it is maintained at this level, the training and the support that the developers get. And I really know that in the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to be more explosive that we have seen in the recent years. Okay, yeah, no, now we've discussed a lot about your work on Btrust, but now let's talk a bit more about on the investment side, because you're also very much involved in investing in projects and trying to support projects in Africa. So for you, how has it really evolved? Because earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that in 2020 October you launched Recursive Capital.
February.
So yeah, so how have you seen the VC fund space evolve through the years in the Bitcoin ecosystem in Africa?
It's been wild to see. I mean, we're still we still have a lot of things to sort out, obviously, as an ecosystem. But more broadly, we're still at a stage where there's only one Bitcoin VC, which is Recursive Capital. So a lot of the work is shouldered essentially on us in terms of structuring foundations, but it's a welcomed difficulty or challenge, really, on my end. And I think what's interesting is all of the work we've been doing since 2020 and kind of how the space has evolved. The most important thing for people to understand is, I guess, context for how all of this started in terms of carving out this whole space all the way up to having such a thriving and vibrant ecosystem, whether it's like really early stage companies to even mid-sized companies or even leading companies like Bitnum, for example. I think it'll be good context. So back in like 20, let's say maybe 2017, 2018, or a couple years before that, everything that had to do with what a Bitcoin company is was essentially just fintech that were operating or accepting Bitcoin. The majority of which, or the vast majority, I should say, were just exchanges slash wallets. So think Bitcoins or some of the earlier companies. And that also contributed to a lot of the reasons why over time a lot of people have had difficulty in navigating and understanding what a Bitcoin company was, because this was birthed out of the fintech space, which was mostly crypto. But the primary way in which they distinguished themselves was the degree to which Bitcoin was tied in, I guess, tied to their essential business model slash how they operate as a company. So from I say 2020 to 2021 was really a critical year for the space, in my opinion, because again, a lot of things happened. Primarily, the bear market that we had, but also
Yeah.
there was a resurgence in rediscovering exactly what it meant to be a Bitcoin company. It was no longer sufficient to just offer Bitcoin as maybe one of the various cryptos that you're offering on your exchange. It was more so about distinguishing yourself from a long-term horizon in terms of how you look at contributing value to the space overall. And the good thing was companies like BitNote, for example, all the way up to obviously the launch of Recursive Capital, a lot of that kind of was at the same time as other VC funds across the world, also understanding this sort of shift that was happening. And I'd say from 2022 to 3, it was building up on top of that distinction and creating it more concretely for people to understand. So there's even a larger niche that will be birthed into what, in my opinion, would end up being a superset for the entire ecosystem, being Bitcoin essentially being the actual fintech space and everything else being consumed as from that lens, which is an interesting full circle. So I'd say in 2022 to 23, we saw a more distinct definition of what a Bitcoin company is, primarily being one whose business model is tied to Bitcoin. Obviously, it thriving is Bitcoin thriving and things like that. And we saw a lot more of an effort by other Bitcoin VCs around the world to create this new ecosystem on top that is well defined, principles understood, and working together to make sure it's thriving. So whether it's co-investments that we've had with a couple of funds like Equidef Capital, Lightning Ventures, Kingsway, Stillmark, and the likes, all the way up to I'd say from 2023 to date, now it has shifted from a redefinition, a breakaway, essentially a hard fork from the fintech space, to now seeing the potential of this space becoming the primary space in which everyone else views investments, all the way up to seeing a critical mass of developers that are now going to work in these companies and to a certain extent even founding their own companies like Stealth Money, Splice Africa, BitPension, and some of the others that actually came from the ABC hackathon from last year, which was also an interesting aspect of
Yeah.
making developers understand how to build for Bitcoin for Africa, essentially by Africans. So I'd say that was kind of the general evolution all the way up to where we find ourselves today with all this diversity.
Awesome that the development of the investment space has been, and like you said, it's just only recursive capital. I'm trying to find anyone else, but it's just you. So, like you said, it's a welcomed challenge, and you have a lot on your table in terms of supporting this project. And so, what are like some of the successful projects that you have already supported through Recursive Capital in Africa?
Well, I say the primary one, which I'm very proud of, is BitNob. And obviously, there are others too, like Fedi and Sonota that I mentioned. But the way in which we're approaching it moving forward is to not only build on those type of successes, but to make sure we have a model that helps replicate, or not even replicate, but create even more successful companies at a steadier rate. So the way in which we're approaching that is over the last, I'd say maybe 2 years, we've had an internal pipeline of ours that goes from really, really early stage companies. So we're talking about people who just have an idea, or maybe they just have some, quickly written document about something they're trying to do, all the way up to those who maybe have like a semi-working MVP. And what we do essentially is take a fixed set of these guys. Initially, it was kind of a bit dynamic over the entirety of 2022, but in 2023 specifically, we made sure it was a fixed set. We took the whole year to get them to the stage where they're investable. Some fell out, some are still around in the process. And in 2025, the main thing for me is building on the success of 2024, which, just to give you insight, is we've seen the success of going from doing this more or less to kind of supplement the pipeline that we have, all the way up to it actually proving to be a very critical aspect of all the investments that we're going to do moving forward. So the process in 25 will be to formalize that and make it open for people to actually apply as opposed to us reaching out to them on an individual basis. So you're going to see a lot more of that pipeline work more in the public. But suffice to say, the main aim is to make sure that, again, we have this steady rate of actual companies coming out that are high quality, and on top of that, obviously funding the existing companies that are at that stage where they're fundable. But more specifically, with the approach of getting them really early on, is it's not only a benefit to Recursive and our internal numbers, but it's also a benefit to the entire African ecosystem and to the world, honestly, because I feel one of our primary theses in Recursive Capital is that because of the unique problem sets in Africa, we're likely going to see the most well-defined Bitcoin companies and the most full-fledging slash highly innovative companies coming out of Africa. So I think
Yeah.
it's definitely one of those things where I really want to make sure that it's well prioritized and well defined to make sure that we have consequences that are even far reaching beyond Africa.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like you said, in the future, to see profound Bitcoin companies coming out from Africa, because Bitcoin for us is really unique from maybe what other people from other parts of the world how they see Bitcoin or how they use it. So it's really very unique and really important for us, and really looking out for that future when we have the ecosystem have more support. Yeah, so a lot of work you are doing uh, on the ecosystem. So, now let's talk about your contributions on Forbes, because I read your articles a lot and you always try to
Thank you.
throw light on a lot that is happening across Africa when it comes to Bitcoin, and also maybe other financial aspects of Africa. So, what are the key development or success stories that you have really seen so far that you think needs to be highlighted more, or that you have been highlighting more in your articles recently?
Oh, quite a lot. And like just first and foremost, I'd like to just take the opportunity to thank Lee Kwan, who's my editor at Forbes. I think the job she's done is very, very incredible. Like if you look back to like 2, 3 years ago, the type of coverage of Bitcoin on Forbes has been not just negative, but it was pretty much not ideal in terms of lacking a level of I guess, depth in terms of the research. So I think having her on board, having her revamp all that whole process of getting actual experts on the ground that are involved in the Bitcoin space, all the way from the developer side to researchers, has really changed the way in which Forbes is viewed as anti-Bitcoin, as it previously was, all the way up to honestly a leading voice in terms of getting well-researched articles as well as special reports. So definitely kudos
Yeah.
to Lee and the team. I think the main thing for me is seeing the kind of the consequences of writing and cataloging this, because for me it was okay, no one really knows exactly what's going on in Africa, including us in Africa. So I felt the primary way in which I could help contribute is to shine light on all these things that are happening. And I've seen it go from a handful of folks that are interested in reading all the way up to some folks in interesting parts of the country without naming specifically where and what parts of the society. But it definitely has had that effect of giving people a place in which they could look for objective analysis about what's happening, whether or not is it fits the assumptions that they have about the space, or maybe some of the ways in which they think the dynamics are playing out, like the stable coins and Bitcoin dynamic. But I think the things to highlight, or things that people should be looking at, is maybe four things. I think the first one that's interesting is on the mining side. Like Africa previously was seen as a no-go zone for mining for maybe broadly two reasons. One, the high risk, and two, Africans are better off finding other ways to electrify and make sure that they're not boiling the oceans or contributing to that. And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of gone from that to flipping it over its head to Bitcoin mining being the only viable option for us to actually electrify. One, have a large amount of socioeconomic impact for people to go from, not having employment all the way up to employment, to even a point where we're creating jobs that never existed. For example, people that repair ASICs, like that's nothing that was around. And I think it's been interesting to see not only that development, but seeing the level and pace in which we're essentially innovating, especially companies like Gridless, for example, at the level of green energy mining, or using mining through, hydro and things like that, and providing blueprints that not just Africa is using, but other parts of the world, whether it looks at dynamics of using Starlink and things like that for redundancy. But I think what's also cool is we went from all the way to, again, Africa can't mine, to Africa is the leading place in which people are looking for mining, but also the innovation to state governments in Africa also prioritizing this for grid energy production slash grid stability slash management, all the way up to electrification. So I think the cool thing that we'll likely see is a mix of seeing all of this innovation that's happening on the ground, to seeing more state government involved, using that for electrification, all the way up to, in the near future, we could definitely see the hash rate going from 1%, which a lot of that really happened the last couple of years, all the way up to, let's say, 5 to 10% globally. So I say that's one. Two would be, I think, the intersection between, again, developing Bitcoin products, but specifically developing Bitcoin products that are attuned to our infrastructure, our existing technology, things that are more ubiquitous to us. So think things like Machinkura that use USSD codes that are more ubiquitous versus other parts of the world, all the way up to his recent project, which is working on SIM cards and making them essentially hardware wallets for Bitcoin. I think what will be cool is focusing in on that space and watching those developments of things that are coming out that are more attuned to our ecosystem and environment. The last point I would say is people should definitely look to African devs in terms of seeing what it means to build at a level of resilience that's required for Bitcoin to still be around in the future. I think those three things are the primary things that are definitely going to keep shaping the future of this space here in Africa.
And based on your articles so far, how do you see the reaction, especially from the investors? Are they now more open to asking questions, or okay, how can I get involved, or how can I start investing, or what can I contribute in the space based on the insights you have been sharing so far?
Oh, a lot. Like, Nick, I can tell you the vibes have definitely changed over the last
Yeah.
couple of years. It was initially questioning, why be a VC if you're just investing exclusively in Bitcoin, all the way up to what are the opportunities in the Bitcoin space, all the way up to now, okay, what are some of the things that we're missing that we're not investing in the Bitcoin space? So a lot has definitely changed. And I think with the aspect of Forbes is, again, we're encouraged to make sure that we are very objective, one, which is very useful if you're trying to provide any sort of convincing argument. So it's not just like cult like narratives. But two, making sure that we actually are accurate about exactly what's happening. So there's nothing like injecting your own frame of reference or what you'd like to see happen and then pretend like it's happening. And the last one really is making sure that you're following up on developments that are happening. So I try not to write pieces that are isolated. I try to make sure that from the very first piece that I wrote last year all the way up to the last piece I wrote last month, there's like a loose storytelling that's happening that has all these layers connected. That way, you could go from reading what might seem like an isolated mining article to discovering everything that's been happening about mining. Likewise, in the development slash innovation. So for a lot of the investors, they looked onto some of these articles as well as the special reports I've written on things like Coinbase and some of the others. And the combination of all those things have definitely provided an easier argument for me to make, because sometimes it's just referencing essentially what I've written. So it's a lot
Yeah.
easier than like making things up where a lot of that data has been there. And honestly, I think the more interesting aspect is not just the pieces that I write, but the pieces that others are also writing that are kind of looking at the developments that's happening to in Africa that I haven't covered, or maybe they've been more at the forefront covering. So the combination of all of that has been very useful for us in terms of convincing people, but more specifically, letting the world know what is exactly happening in this space.
Exactly. I really agree that, hearing really from someone on the ground that really see what is happening, is really different from maybe someone somewhere maybe using their Google to put one or two together and then put it out there and say this is what is happening. So I guess that's really the difference, because now you are very much involved and you're always on the ground in Africa. So putting out the information, makes a lot of difference, and hopefully it will continue like that, and then people will get to see more and understand more. But I also think that in as much as maybe these investors might be asking questions and are interested in maybe seeing how they can get involved. Do you think like the regulatory factors across Africa, is it a challenge for them, or how does it look like?
It's always going to be a challenge for them, Nick. Like, I think what's interesting with Africa is we're in this almost semi-permanent limbo of having a high risk profile, regardless of what industry you're trying to invest in. So already have that high burden that we have to overcome. And then narrowing that into Bitcoin, which already is perceived as like something that's either too far fetched or maybe it's for criminals and things like that. And then on top of that, narrowing down that focus to say that there's this high amount of signal that's going to encompass the entire space is definitely daunting. I think what's interesting is to again, go back in time and look at how regulation has evolved. Like we've gone from Bitcoin is basically banned all across Africa, well, at least perceived as such, from the CBN's quasi ban of the essentially not allowing bank accounts to be tied to crypto transactions, blah blah blah, all the way up to going into this weird period where that, in my opinion, my humble opinion, causing the P2P market in Nigeria to take off to levels where we've been consistently leading for the last couple of years. And I think is one of those unanticipated consequences of regulation that's done out of fear as opposed to a calculated way in which takes in a more holistic approach. So all of that happened. The INERA launch, which some people have their own opinions or theories about kind of the timings between that. I don't dabble in all those kind of prognostications. So we went from quasi ban, this large period of forcing everything on the ground to P2P, where we have essentially probably the biggest P2P market in the world, all the way up to the CBN reversing that ban, and then now focusing more constructively, in my opinion, in crafting regulation and making sure that they balance out two things: defending the naira, defending the economic challenges that we're facing, but also providing this thriving ecosystem for these things to flourish. Because one thing they can't deny at this point is that there are socioeconomic benefits to allowing and embracing Bitcoin thrive on the continent. So, especially in the country, Nigeria. So, we're definitely past the idea of this Bitcoin thing, can we ignore it? Is now okay. How can we actually approach this productively? Like, what are you guys doing? And for us, it's incumbent on us really as ecosystem stakeholders to go, okay, this is what we're looking at. And specifically, please, we are Bitcoin. This is crypto. It's not the same thing. I think once we get past that, everything else is going to be a lot easier for us to understand in terms of the frameworks, how we want to approach that, even on a case by case basis. So we'll see. Fingers crossed. I think we're in a much better spot, but there's definitely a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I agree. There is definitely a lot of work to do in terms of policy, but hopefully, like you said, it's really very difficult to always differentiate, to tell them no, Bitcoin is not crypto, it's quite different. So, and I'm sure that when we get to that point when they clearly understand the difference, then maybe we have a clear and a good policy for Bitcoin that can help to positively impact the the space. I don't know, maybe positively. Would I say positively? Because they try to make a negative impact and then the negative impact turns to be positive. So, but hopefully we get it all cleared and then we can see agree more when it comes to Bitcoin and for the policy makers as well.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
And
So
I'll just say
I mean, it
one
has.
thing, Nick, just to buttress your point, which is interesting, is just look at it two ways. Like, if they do decide to stick their head in the sand, Bitcoin, because of the level of resilience and obviously the approach that we have of making sure it's resilient, will still thrive. But it's just going to thrive at a pace in which is all encompassing in terms of the benefits if they just embrace it. So that's pretty much the difference in terms of how they want to approach it.
Yeah, let's hope they embrace it. If
They
not, we
will.
still
Well, one.
if not, we still keep going. Yeah, so it has been really, good and insightful conversation with you. But before we round up, we need to talk about the future to know how does it, look like for the future of Bitcoin in Africa. So how do you perceive the future to be? Maybe 5 to 10 years. How do you see the ecosystem in Africa generally?
Definitely a very thriving and vibrant space. I think we're definitely not going to recognize the degree to which a lot of this change will happen in the next couple of years. Again, back to the initial convo we had, like the last 2 years is when all of this has happened. Like imagine the next
Yeah.
5 to 10 years, especially now that we keep increasing the structures that we have, making sure pipelines are efficient and implementing all the right things that we need to get there. I think what will be cool to see is how quickly we'll go from being looked at as a part of the world that isn't contributing as much to Bitcoin to making to having a point where it's almost impossible to talk about Bitcoin development or the Bitcoin space without talking about Africa first. I think we're definitely going to see that in terms of how the future unfolds, and that's really one of the main things that keeps me going every day, really, to contribute at this level is making sure that we not only help contribute to this conversation, but we lead it really in a point that's positive and holistic, and we make sure that everyone benefits from all the insights and finally all the troubles that are in Africa, making sure that we lead the charge in proving to the world that yes, you could have all this adversity, but it's actually a strength if you know how to use it.
Awesome, and I'm also, really looking forward to that future. And finally, because I know you've really had a lot of experience from how you started developing up to this moment, so I would like you to, what do you advise for young developers in Africa that wants to get started, or maybe a developer anywhere that wants to, but specifically for Africans that wants to get started on developing on Bitcoin? What would be your advice for them, and how do you really think that in this era they can should get started?
No, for sure. Like, first and foremost, welcome. You had a good time. I think that the easiest way I could recommend is going to btrust.tech, our website, and seeing exactly what all of this space is about. And more importantly, like whether you do decide to apply to the Builders program itself, I think the most important thing I found is kind of maybe broadly 3 to 4 things. One is immersing yourself in the ecosystem. So seek out our Discord, get yourself involved in the development space. Two, scavenge around the open source space and see what piques your interest and just kind of keep up with the development. Third, I would say is definitely don't try to do everything at once. It's impossible. Like even for us that are deeply entrenched in the space, it's difficult to keep track of everything, and it's even doubly difficult to try and do everything in terms of your contributions. The last thing I would say is to try and make sure that you don't get too complacent or too comfortable doing the same thing over and over again. That's when you invite a lack of progress in your career as well as kind of the way you look at things. The moment you feel it's getting a little bit too easy. Definitely seek out some more adventure or challenge to make sure that you have that growth. I'd say those 4 things are broadly the things that you need. Everything else, I'd say, honestly, the only way for you guys to have a good experience or a very long and sustainable career is to just keep doing things and keep pushing the limits at which you're able to build really and making sure that you have that growth in terms of capacity. Like once you do that, there's nothing that can stop you, honestly, but yourself.
Thank you so much for that advice. And if you are a developer that's watching this episode, you really need to pin this part down and try to follow to the process that he has just said now, so that you can be maybe they can be like you. So because the
Better.
advice is
That's
coming
the
from
aim.
you. So, and yeah, finally to round up, what are you currently working on, or what project are you focused on? I know you are doing a lot of things, but maybe you can try to.
Don't worry, I'll keep my answers political as usual. It's again just breaking it up, like in terms of just purely as a developer myself, obviously continuing work on Bitcoin Core and making sure that I do my part reviewing code and helping others out in their journey. But more broadly with Btrust, again, like I said, a lot of the developments and things that are unfolding with structures and more transparency, more understanding on how people can get involved. With Recursive Capital, a lot of that, like I said, is making sure that we have way better communications when it comes to publicly inviting these early stage companies, understanding what Recursive is all about, the things that we're involved in. And I say thirdly is with the recent wallet that I launched is making sure that there's a good ecosystem and community around it in terms of taking it on because the best case scenario for that type of product is to make it community led. I only did it all by myself because it's obviously the quickest way in which you could do something. But now that it's out there in the world, the aim is to make sure that people take this on as kind of a template reference wallet for people to build. The last thing I would say that I'm most looking forward to is the Africa Bitcoin conference. I think if there's any developer right now that is completely confused about where to go next, go to Nairobi on the 8th and then stay all the way up to the end of the conference from 9 to 11th. You're going to learn a lot. Your life is going to change for the better, and you never look back.
Awesome. Thank you so much for making out time to share lots and lots of insight. I really enjoyed this one with you. Thank you so much for all the insight and also for all the work you are doing to foster the Bitcoin development in Africa. And I mean, it was like when we were talking, that was when I remember, oh, you built a wallet, and we didn't. Maybe I guess we are going to schedule another call to talk about to really talk about it so that people can really understand. Because I'm always really really happy when I see products that are built by Africans, because it's always built from a place of understanding and experience, and it's always best fit for Africans. So hopefully we'll have another time where we can talk more on it. So thank you so much for joining the conversation today, and hoping to see you soon at the ABC from 9th to 11th of December in Nairobi. Thank you so much, Abubakar, for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick.